Welcome to Arabiya English. We have with us today Dr. Shashi Tharoor, top UN diplomat, India's ex-foreign minister, a very successful politician, and more importantly a social media star. But what brings him here is this book called Why I Am a Hindu. So I would like to begin. Thanks for your time.
That's not why I'm here, Shabdu. That is my newest book in India,
Yes.
out a month ago.
Yes.
I'm here still plugging my previous book from last year,
Right.
which was called An Era of Darkness in India, the British Empire in India.
Yes.
And in Britain was called Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India.
Right.
And since the organizers of the Emirates Literary Festival are all Brits,
Yes.
they're still focused on that, whereas the people from India are focused on the new
moved
one.
on.
But we can talk about both or whichever one you want to.
No, yeah, you can give us a background. You're going to talk about it. I know you have a session lined up, so you can give us a brief on that, and then I'll have a specific question on the latest.
Okay, well, no, on Inglorious Empire, there's not much to be said because, as you know, it's been rather widely out on social media. It basically makes the argument that the British came to what was one of the richest countries in the world, in fact was the richest country in the world in 1700, and over 200 years of exploitation, drainage of resources, reduced it to a poster child for third world poverty, left us in 1947 with 90% of our population below the poverty line, a life expectancy of 27, an economic growth rate that for the previous half a century had been below 0.01%, and essentially on our knees, also shattered by the horrors of the partition of 1947.
Right.
So where we had to build ourselves up from at that point was really quite a horror, and yet so many people wrongly are being allowed to believe that the British presence was on the whole benign, which it was not, and therefore it was important to set the record straight. Since my talking about this and writing it struck a chord, it's been one of my more successful books, perhaps my most successful book in the kind of span it's been around, just over a year. Right. And I'm looking forward to seeing how the Dubai audience reacts to it.
The book, of course, it will be great if you talk briefly about that. But then I want to pick your brains on this idea of religion in today's world, how it encapsulates the lives and inter-community relationships that exist today. Looking at the politics of exceedingly right-wing politics that we literally see across the world.
You see, religion in and of itself is absolutely nothing wrong. Every human being has an innate desire to reach out, to stretch his hands out to his creator or to whatever it is, the larger forces. When he looks up beyond the horizon, there is something there that he wants to connect to. Obviously, there are the small percentage of human beings who are atheists or agnostics and don't have a religion, but the vast majority of humanity subscribes to one religion or another. And I see nothing wrong with that. Where I have a problem is when as you said correctly, when politics comes into religion, when religion becomes a badge of political identity and is used to hit people of other religions with. And this is true, unfortunately, of very many faiths. We've seen the religious violence between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland. Right. We've seen the Crusades when Muslims and Christians were attacking each other. We've seen, sadly, Hindu-Muslim violence in the subcontinent. We've seen Jews and Muslims in the Middle East. So religious violence or the wielding of religion as one's principal source of identity and therefore an instrument to attack others with is where I have a problem. So as a Hindu, I feel most entitled to write about my own faith. Right. And in my book, Why I Am a Hindu, I've described my Hinduism, perhaps a presumptuous phrase, but the Hinduism I grew up with, observed, learned, cared about. And I said, hey, listen, this is not the Hindutva ideology that our present ruling forces are propagating. My Hinduism is very much an accepting, open, liberal faith, which has never claimed to be the only true faith, which has never said you have to conform to a certain set of dictates or a litmus test to be saved. That has not been our approach, and that has not been the approach taught by any of our great teachers, including some of the very names that these people cite, like Swami Vivekananda and so on. So I have sought in this book to lay out my vision of my faith, to describe their attitudes, those of the so-called Hindutva movement, and then to make an urgent plea to take Hinduism back for the liberal Hindu. That's what that book is all about. But you know, I remember a comment that my old boss at the United Nations, Kofi Annan, made years ago. He said, it's never the problem with the faith, but with the faithful.
Yeah.
every faith basically preaches decency, humanity,
Peace.
worship of God, respect, and so on. The faithful are so convinced that theirs is the only way that they want to, unfortunately, attack everybody else whom they see as being in error.
Right. This interplay of religion in society, do you see different countries around the world or different societies around the world at different trajectories? So if you were to compare the experience India has had with religion, is it any different from, say, the Gulf region or the Middle East? How do you look at that?
Well, India historically has been a much more eclectic place. I mean, let's face it, the Gulf countries were overwhelmingly mono-faith. That is that Islam, for 1,000 years or more, has been the faith of more than 90%, even more than 95% of the population. Lebanon has had a significant Christian minority. There has been a small minority of other faiths, the Jews, the Baha'is, the Zoroastrians in Persia. But by and large, the Middle East has had, if you like, the strengths and the weaknesses of having only one faith around them. The strengths that everyone follows the same sort of approach, religion becomes something that is a communally knitting bond for the overwhelming numbers of the population. The weakness is that therefore there is much less understanding of or accommodation of other ways of worship, other ways of belief, and therefore often as a result very little room for dissent. If there is no dissenting view on religion, where will there be dissent in politics? And these are some of the issues that have come up. In India, however, we've always lived in a pluralist society where many faiths coexisted at the same time. Where we've had, in my own state of Kerala, for example, we have the oldest Jewish population outside Palestine. It came with the destruction of their first temple by the Babylonians. We had the oldest Muslim population outside the Middle East because in the lifetime of the Prophet, the message of Islam came peacefully through traders and missionaries because the Arabs had been trading with Kerala for literally hundreds of years before the Prophet was even born.
True.
So when the Chinese Zhang He came on his voyages, he found Chinese merchants living in some of the port cities of Kerala. When travelers from the Middle East like Al-Biruni, Ibn Battuta and so on traveled, they found various groups from other parts of the world resident in Kerala. So my own view is that that kind of culture is the culture that India is used to, and therefore it is in many ways quite different from the mono-religious culture that you see by and large in the Middle East.
I was speaking to an American congressman and he said, you know, the problem is 80% Arabs are Muslims, but 80% Muslims are not Arabs. So you also have a very sizable Muslim population living outside the Arab world. Does that complicate the image problem that Islam has today? Yeah,
I think in fact the vast majority of Muslims are actually Asians. Between India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Indonesia, you have actually got somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 million Muslims. And the entire Arab world put together, I think, comes to about less than 300 or 250. So there is no comparison, but it is important to acknowledge that those 700 million look to this 200 plus million as the fount, the crucible, the center of their faith. Mecca is still where they turn to pray. That's where they want to come on the Hajj or the Umrah. This is where the locus of their search for the divine is centered. And that gives certainly the Arab world a very special place in the Islamic consciousness.
Perfect. India-Gulf relations, moving beyond remittance from one side and energy interdependence on the other, do you see a scope for a greater engagement between India and India?
Well, those two are already very big things. Energy security for India and the remittance security. We have had something like $70 billion coming from hard-working, for the most part, blue-collar workers in the Gulf countries from India, and in fact a majority from my state of Kerala, though some from your state as well, Shah. However, I would say that the third thing we would look for from here is also somewhat selfish, in that we would like to see more investment coming from the resource surplus countries into India. And we would want to strengthen, we already are strengthening the national security cooperation, where we've been very gratified that countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE who have sought refuge in their countries. And that's why a criminal like Dawood Ibrahim used to flit in and out of the UAE, now stays put in Pakistan, because he knows that here, these are states that cooperate against this kind of behavior. And security cooperation is also something that's very important.
Thank you very much for the time. It was lovely talking to you.
Pleasure.
I would have